All right, everybody. So let's move on from plankton and start to think about bigger stuff. So we're going to be talking about the benthic community, and then we'll talk a little bit about fish. So when you think about the ecology of a lake, oftentimes we think of this left picture over here where we have a lake ecosystem with all these big organisms. So fish, turtles, and waterfowl, and osprey, and beavers and all sorts of different things, like the big stuff that you see. And that's not, uncommon that, we don't think about necessarily tiny little organisms and bacteria and algae as much as we do about the big stuff that we can see and frankly eat. But when you think about the ecology of a lake, you should really be thinking about this picture here on the right, where we have bacteria and viruses working against each other, I should say, to have a functioning ecosystem, and a lot of those nutrients then going up into the algae and zooplankton. Okay, so when we think about, like what is driving the ecology of a lake, it's not the big stuff that you can see. It's actually all conglomeration of a bunch of tiny little plankton. So the reality is that's oftentimes undervalued. But like biogeochemistry is really where ecology lies, or limnological ecology lies. Okay, but that being said, let's think about those big stuff that we can see. So the benthos. Okay, now the benthic community is really hard to generalize. Okay, we can say things about plankton maybe, but a lot of plankton work in the same way by absorbing nutrients and through the water column, through their cell membranes and things like that. But basically, what we have in the benthic community is every single phylum that's ever existed, right? So certainly in the oceans, but not in lakes so much. But you have arthropods, you have mollusks, you have vertebrates that are down there. So like every single type of organism inhabits the benthos, either in an ocean or a lake or a river or a wetland or something. So and when we look at like a pelagic environment, it's really easy to say, well, this pot of water or this portion of water over here in one part of the lake is very similar to the open water in the other part of the lake because it's literally mixed up. That's not the case with the benthic environment, right? There's differences in the sediments just from 1 meter to another meter, potentially. So it's a little bit harder to say some things about these. But what we can do is we can break the benthic zone into 3 like subzones, okay? The littoral, which is, the shallow water along the shoreline. Doesn't necessarily have to be on a shoreline, but like you could have if you had an island or something right here, you would have some littoral zone right there. Well, all the way down to here basically. But then there's the limnetic benthic zone, which is from basically right here to right here. So basically where there's no plants down to where there's no light. And then the profundal, which is the benthic zone where there is essentially very little light. So let's go through those 3 zones. Benthic littoral zone. This is where you have aquatic vegetation, okay? And of the benthic zones, this is by far the most complex, and that's due to you have lake sediments, you have rocks, potentially gravel, sand, silt, clays, and then on top of that you have all of the aquatic vegetation, plants, and there's different types of plants, floating plants, emergent plants, which are generally the shallowest, and then there's some floating leafed plants. Then you have submerged plants that don't make it to the top, and all of these areas allow for much more attachment of periphyton, much more places for organisms to hide from predators, and just more going on. Generally, what we see is this benthic habitat is always oxygenated, unless it's a really eutrophic lake. It's oxygenated because there's light penetrating to the sediment, so that paraphyton, the plants and the algae that's all in there is going to be producing oxygen. So due to all the habitat complexity, the more the three-dimensional areas, you have the most phyla that exist here, right? You have the most species, it's the most diverse. As you get a little deeper though, this is the non-vegetated benthic area within the epilimnion. Basically, so what we see is, the sun here is going to be shining down to this area, generally, right? Unless it's a really eutrophic lake. And what we can think of this is this area as the oxygenated benthos below that vegetation line. It's relatively low habitat complexity, right? So usually we have smaller sediments in a lake in this area. You're not going to find a lot of big rocks. It'll mostly just be, sand and silt. And there's high oxygen, so you can have a lot of types of organisms. But most of those organisms are going to be burrowing within that sand, right? There'll be potentially some paraphyton over the top of it, but it's harder for organisms to just grow like on top of sand or within the sand. So one of the reasons for this burrowing is that there's a lot of visual predators here. So whether we're talking about like fish, like a bluegill or something that is patrolling these waters, patrolling that sediment, looking for things to eat. So one of the only ways to do that, or to not get eaten, is to burrow within that sediment. So go deeper then. These are the aphotic sediments. Now the oxygenation, whether there's oxygen down there, is really dependent on the trophic status of a lake, right? So if you have a eutrophic lake like here on the bottom, right, during the summer when there's stratification, and during the winter when there's low light penetration, you don't have, as you go down, you don't have any oxygen, right? No oxygen here. So I shouldn't say that there's like no oxygen. There's oftentimes a tiny bit of oxygen, but it's pretty hard for things to live there when there is low to no oxygen. So very few organisms can make it down there. Whether we're talking about a eutrophic or an oligotrophic lake, this is the most homogeneous benthic zone, right? Really fine sediments, and what that translates then to is the lowest diversity. So in the clearest of the oligotrophic lakes, if you have this crystal clear water like that picture there on the left, you could potentially have zero benthic profundal zone, right? But in a more, if light penetrates all the way down to the bottom of the lake, or if the lake is shallow enough, this zone might not exist. It might just kind of all be the benthic limnetic zone. But if the lake is somewhat turbid, this water over here is pretty clear, right? You can see at least a couple of meters in this lake, and from there we would, if the lake was like this, you would have a benthic profundal zone. So here's kind of what I was saying. Then a oligotrophic lake, the benthic profundal zone might not exist. It wouldn't be different really than the benthic limnetic zone. But in a eutrophic lake, you're going to get anoxic sediments. If not, like anoxic water right above those sediments, in the sediments themselves, they're going to be anoxic, because the bacteria that's living in those sediments are going to be respiring and using up that oxygen very, very quickly. So really, you only get a couple organisms that can survive here. In lakes around here, what we would get is some diptera, some bloodworms that we have right here. They have that hemoglobin that allows them to suck up oxygen and hang on to it. There's some worms, some annelid, oligocete worms that can survive down there. And then there's these things called fingernail clams, which are relatively common in lakes around here deep down, and they have really low oxygen tolerances. So, or I should say high tolerances to low oxygen. So they can live within those sediments, no problem. But, in lakes around here, that's pretty much all you get. It's because there's, it's basically all just silt, and there's not a lot of oxygen. What that means is there's only a few organisms that can survive there, but they can be in relatively high densities. So when we move to the fish, then what I want to say is that fish can have a lot of biodiversity, or sorry, a lot of biomass in a lake, but the actual like flow of energy into the fish is really, really small compared to energy flowing through the plankton and the zooplankton, the phytoplankton and the zooplankton. That just dwarfs how much energy is flowing into the fish. Now, the fish are long lived, they're just not very productive compared to the plankton community. So even though fish, like we think of them as really important and can have like really high levels of predation, it can influence species composition. So there's some studies that show that fish can remove up to 50% of the biomass in a produced in the benthic zone, but it doesn't actually like impact the benthic zone that much. What we see is the biggest driver of the benthic um, the benthic zone of the organisms that live there is just food supply. And where you find them versus where you find them is really just dependent on food. So, what can we say about fish in an oligotrophic lake versus a eutrophic lake? So, first off, the biggest difference is that there's clear water. So you can have visual predators, right? Those lake trout. Here's a lake trout. Maybe this isn't the greatest picture, but this eye is pretty big. Walleye themselves have very big eyes. This is a white fish has a big eye, and they're able to use their eyes and use visual cues to do predation. Okay, um, what we see then is, as soon as a lake starts to get eutrophic, it's not necessarily that, they don't have the right food or whatever. It's that they sometimes can't find their food and can't um, eat it because then, it's too cloudy and murky for them to be able to find their food. One thing that is really common with oligotrophic fish is that they have a really low thermal tolerance, meaning the range of temperatures that they can survive in is really, really small. And it's usually meaning in cold water. Okay, so lake trout need really, really cold water. This is also true with a lot of trout species, that are like brown trout, brook trout, rainbow trout that live in streams. They also have they have to have cold water. And it's not because they can't survive in warm water, it's because the warm water itself doesn't have enough oxygen. All of these fish that we're showing here, lake trout, walleye, they're really, really active swimmers and they're swimming extremely quickly. And that takes a lot of oxygen. So if they don't have the oxygen, um, they're not going to be able to be as active and they're not going to be able their metabolism will just use up that oxygen faster than they can get it and then they die. When we think about a oligotrophic fish community, think of, what species do you find in northern Wisconsin? And that's, a lot of trout, walleye, perch, pike, and muskie, that kind of thing. Now compare that to the fish species you would expect in a eutrophic lake. One of the big things is that the water is really turbid, right? There's a bunch of algae in the lake and you can't see very far, right? So it doesn't pay to be a visual predator. So we see a lot more chemosynthetic sensory reception, basically fish that smell the water. Now, how do fish smell the water? There's two ways, basically. One is with their barbels. Okay, so this is a common carp, and you can see right there, basically this fish swims along the bottom using its barbels to taste what, they drag it along the bottom of the water. Same with a catfish here. They drag these barbels along the sediments, and when it touches something like any food, it'll just suck it up. Okay, and this is why you can use like stink. It's called stink bait to catch catfish, right? And you use this really yucky smelling stuff, and you put it in a little lure with a hook that holds onto that stink bait for a while, and then the catfish, as they're swimming along, they can either touch it directly or sense that smell within the water, and then they go to it and then they suck up your hook, right? So we see all sorts of variety of fishes that will use barbels to, and other. I forgot about the other mode of chemosensory, which is a lot of fish have these little holes. Okay, and so if you look, I'll try to draw it here. That's probably not going to be a very good picture. So let's just say this is the nose of a fish, right? And what they have is basically like a U-shaped, oh boy, a U-shaped hole, tube. Okay, so if you look here, if you were to look closely, there's basically one hole up front, like right there, and then in the back, I totally covered it up. I'm sorry. There's another one here. Let me get back, and now let's go back to it. Oh, I screwed up my picture. Anyway, in that fish, right, with that U-shaped hole, it's kind of like a nostril here. So what water does is water goes in the front of it and it flows through here and then it comes out here. And it's like there's nerve endings all along here that can smell for a variety of different substances. And so check that out next time you catch a fish. Up towards their nose, they have these little. They're not nostrils, but they're analogous to nostrils in the sense that they can smell the water with those. So we see a lot of ictalurids, catfish, cyprinids, minnows, centrarchids. These are the sunfishes. So things like a largemouth bass or bluegill. And generally what we see is in eutrophic lakes, you don't really have as many specialist fishes. You have fishes that are really general and can eat just about anything. And what we see is next time you look at a fish, look at its mouth, look at its body shape. And a lot of what you can see is that you can instantly tell what a fish is eating, where in the water column it is eating, and based on its, basically its mouth. Open up a shark's mouth and you right away know, oh, this great white shark here is a big predator that needs to have these teeth to cut flesh, whereas this basking shark over here is, not a, well, it is a predator in the sense that it's eating zooplankton, but it's not eating big things, right? It's a filter feeder, whereas this shark here is going to be feeding off the benthic community, looking for mussels and worms and all sorts of stuff within the soft sediments. And you can do that not just with sharks, but you can do that with fish that you just catch anywhere. All right, with that ends that lecture. I'll see you later.